At exactly 23:45 hours on August 6, 1943, three Japanese destroyers exploded simultaneously in the pitch-black waters of Vila Gulf. Within 37 minutes, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost 500 men, 3 warships, and something far more valuable, their 2-decade dominance of night combat. The commanding officer who survived that night, Captain Kaju Sugiura, had literally written the manual on torpedo attacks. He had trained hundreds of officers. He was considered one of the finest destroyer tacticians in the entire Pacific Fleet, and he never saw the enemy that destroyed him. Not once. Not a single American ship appeared on his horizon. His lookouts, trained for years to see in darkness, spotted nothing until torpedoes were already tearing through steel hulls. How did 6 American destroyers annihilate 3/4 of a Japanese force without being detected? The answer involves a technology so revolutionary that Japanese commanders refused to believe it existed, even as their ships sank beneath them. By mid-1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy had dominated night surface combat for 2 consecutive years. Their record was terrifying. At the Battle of Savo Island on August 9, 1942, Japanese cruisers surprised an Allied force and sank 4 heavy cruisers in just 32 minutes. 4 heavy cruisers. Gone. In half an hour. The American ships had early radar systems, but their commanders did not trust the technology. By the time lookouts made visual identification, Japanese torpedoes were already in the water. At the Battle of Tassafaronga, on November 30, 1942, 8 Japanese destroyers engaged 5 American heavy cruisers and 4 destroyers. The result: the Japanese sank 1 cruiser and heavily damaged 3 others, while losing only a single destroyer. American commanders reported being ambushed, despite having radar detection of the Japanese force. The pattern repeated across dozens of engagements throughout the Solomon Islands campaign. Japanese destroyers would appear from darkness, launch devastating torpedo salvos, and vanish before American gunners could respond. American casualties mounted. Cruisers became floating coffins. Destroyer crews learned to fear the night. The Japanese called their resupply missions to isolated garrisons the Tokyo Express. American sailors called it something else, a death sentence for anyone trying to stop it. Japanese success was not accidental. It resulted from institutional commitment to night fighting doctrine that began in the 1920s. The Imperial Japanese Navy recognized that Japan's industrial capacity could never match American shipbuilding. Numerical inferiority was inevitable. Therefore, Japanese doctrine emphasized achieving qualitative superiority through superior training, superior tactics, and superior weapons. Night combat became a central focus because darkness neutralized enemy advantages in numbers and production capacity. Japanese lookouts underwent rigorous selection for exceptional eyesight, measured at 20/20 or better in both eyes. Night vision training began at the Naval Academy and continued throughout a sailor's career. Lookouts ate diets rich in vitamin A. They dark adapted for hours before operations wearing red-lensed goggles to preserve light sensitivity. They practiced identifying ships by silhouette until they could distinguish destroyer classes at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters in moonless conditions. Their Type 93 torpedo, called Long Lance by Americans, outranged anything the United States Navy possessed. Maximum range at 36 knots was 40,000 meters. American torpedoes could barely reach 500 meters. The Japanese could engage targets from 3 to 4 times farther away. But everything was about to change because of something the Japanese could not see, could not hear, and refused to believe existed. Captain Kaju Sugiura represented the pinnacle of Japanese destroyer expertise. Promoted to captain on November 15, 1940, he had commanded destroyer divisions since December 1941. In February 1943, he took command of Destroyer Division 4, consisting of Hagakaze, Arashi, Kawakaze, and Shigure. But his most important credential was this: he had recently served as chief instructor at the Imperial Japanese Navy Torpedo School. He understood torpedo tactics as well as anyone in the fleet. He had literally written sections of the official manual on coordinated night attacks. Commander Tamechi Hara was equally accomplished. Born October 16, 1900, Hara had graduated from the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy in 1921. In 1932, while serving as a surface warfare instructor, Hara wrote a comprehensive torpedo attack manual that was adopted as official doctrine. Both men were experts in night combat. Both had decades of experience. Both had survived multiple engagements. Both understood that Japanese night fighting superiority depended on three factors: superior optical equipment, superior lookout training, and aggressive tactical doctrine. On the American side, Commander Frederick Moosbrugger received orders on August 5th to lead a pure destroyer strike force into Vela Gulf. Moosbrugger was not famous. He was not a celebrated tactician. He was simply a competent officer given command of 6 Fletcher-class destroyers and told to stop the Tokyo Express. His force consisted of USS Dunlap, USS Craven, USS Maury, USS Lang, USS Sterett, and USS Stack. All 6 ships were commissioned in 1942 and early 1943. Each carried 5 5-inch guns, 10 torpedo tubes, and something the Japanese destroyers completely lacked: SG surface search radar and Mark 37 fire control systems. The SG radar operated at approximately 3,000 MHz using a 10-centimeter wavelength. Under ideal conditions, it could detect destroyer-sized targets at 12,000 to 15,000 meters. Most importantly, it worked in complete darkness. Visual lookouts were limited to perhaps 1,000 meters in the conditions present in Vela Gulf. Radar could see 8 to 10 times farther. Moosbrugger understood this advantage completely. On the morning of August 6th, Moosbrugger called a conference of his commanding officers and outlined a plan that broke completely with previous American destroyer doctrine. First, the 6 destroyers would operate in 2 parallel divisions separated by approximately 4,000 meters. Second, they would maintain absolute radio silence except for essential tactical communications. Previous engagements had become chaotic when voice radio circuits jammed with unnecessary chatter. Third, and this was considered radical, the destroyers would not give away their position with gunfire until after torpedoes had been launched and begun hitting targets. Previous doctrine called for illuminating targets with searchlights and opening fire immediately. Moosbrugger understood that muzzle flashes revealed ship positions. Radar-directed torpedo attacks in complete darkness would give Americans decisive advantage. Fourth, all ships would rely primarily on radar for situational awareness. This inverted traditional doctrine, where radar merely confirmed visual sightings. Moosbrugger made radar the primary sensor. Many senior officers considered this approach dangerously reckless. Radar was still viewed as experimental technology. Trusting electronic systems over trained human eyes seemed foolish. But Moosbrugger had studied the previous night battles carefully. He understood that Japanese optical superiority meant nothing if Americans could strike from beyond visual range. Meanwhile, Captain Sugiura was planning his own mission. On August 4th, he called a briefing aboard Hajikaze at Rabaul. His previous transport mission to Kolombangara on August 1st had been a complete success. 900 troops and 120 tons of supplies delivered without loss. Therefore, the mission would be repeated on August 6th. Same route, same procedure, same timing. Commander Hara immediately protested. Captain, with respect, repeating the exact same route and timing is extremely dangerous. The Americans will be expecting us. Sugiura shook his head. The route has been specified by higher headquarters. Communications difficulties prevent changes. The landing coordinates have already been provided to ground forces. We cannot alter the plan. Hara pressed further. Then at least allow Shigure to proceed ahead as a scout. We can detect any enemy presence and warn the formation. Sugiura refused. Shigure's engines were in poor condition. Scouting ahead was impossible. All 4 ships would proceed together. Intelligence reports made no mention of American destroyers operating independently in Vela Gulf. The Japanese believed Americans relied heavily on cruiser firepower and used destroyers only for screening. Independent destroyer operations were not anticipated. This intelligence assessment was catastrophically wrong. At 11:30 hours on August 6th, Moosbrugger's task group departed Tulagi. Weather was typical for the South Pacific in August: intermittent rain squalls, low clouds, no moon. Perfect conditions for radar. Terrible conditions for visual spotting. As darkness fell, Moosbrugger ordered battle stations. Crews donned life jackets and helmets. Damage control parties positioned themselves. Gun crews loaded shells but did not train their weapons, which would have created noise Japanese lookouts might detect. Torpedo tubes were trained to port toward the expected threat axis. At 22:33 hours, USS Dunlap's SG radar detected contacts bearing north-northwest at range 29,500 meters, nearly 16 nautical miles away. The contact quickly resolved into 4 distinct pips. The Japanese destroyers were exactly where intelligence predicted, approaching Vela Gulf on schedule. Moosbrugger watched the radar display in Dunlap's Combat Information Center. 4 contacts in column formation, speed approximately 30 knots, heading south-southeast. The geometry was almost perfect. The Americans were positioned between the Japanese and the mountains of Kolombangara, invisible against the dark landmass. The Japanese were approaching through open water with no background to conceal them. For 20 minutes, American radar operators tracked the Japanese force, while Japanese lookouts saw nothing. 20 minutes of perfect information against complete blindness. At 23:41 hours, with range close to 6,300 meters, Commander Moosbrugger gave the order: fire. USS Dunlap launched 8 torpedoes. USS Craven fired 8 torpedoes. USS Maury fired 8 torpedoes. 24 weapons entered the water in 63 seconds. The torpedoes had been set to run at 36 knots. Time to target approximately 3 to 4 minutes. As soon as the last torpedo cleared the tubes, Moosbrugger ordered a 90-degree turn to starboard. All 3 ships turned hard right and accelerated, withdrawing before the Japanese even knew they existed. Aboard Hagikaze, Captain Sugiura stood on the bridge, watching darkness. His formation was making 30 knots, maintaining precise 500-meter spacing. Navigation was proceeding perfectly. If Sugiura had possessed radar, it would have shown 6 American destroyers less than 6,000 meters away, and torpedoes closing at combined speed of 66 knots. Sugiura had no radar. He had lookouts with exceptional night vision, but lookouts could not see through total darkness. At 23:43 hours, Shigure's lookout called out, "White waves, black objects, several ships heading toward us." Commander Hara did not hesitate. He ordered torpedoes launched and emergency turn to starboard. But 500 meters ahead, the 3 leading destroyers were still attempting to identify contacts when American torpedoes arrived. At 23:45 hours, the first torpedo struck Hagikaze's starboard side directly beneath the boiler room. The warhead contained 1,000 pounds of high explosive. Seawater and steam erupted inward as shattered piping released superheated vapor at 600 degrees. Men died instantly. 2 more torpedoes slammed into Hagikaze within 30 seconds. One struck the forward engine room. The other penetrated near the magazine. The ammunition detonated. The blast lifted the bow completely out of water and broke the ship's spine. Arashi took 2 hits amidships. Both struck below the waterline, shattering the keel and igniting fuel. The ship stopped from 30 knots to 0 in 90 seconds. Kawakaze suffered the worst. A single torpedo struck directly under the bridge in the forward magazine, containing dozens of 5-inch shells. The magazine detonated. The forward third of the destroyer disappeared. The remaining hull rolled over and sank in less than 2 minutes. In 37 minutes, Commander Moosbrugger's force destroyed 3 Japanese destroyers and killed over 1,500 men. American casualties: 1 sailor with a crushed hand. Commander Hara escaped in Shigure, the only Japanese ship to survive. But as he fled north toward Rabaul, he understood something that would haunt Japanese commanders for the remainder of the war. The Americans could see through darkness. Everything Japanese destroyers had trained for, everything their doctrine assumed, everything their superiority depended upon, had just become obsolete. But this was only the beginning. The lessons of Vela Gulf would reshape naval warfare entirely. In Part 2, we will see how the Japanese High Command reacted to this disaster, what desperate measures they attempted to counter American radar, and why those measures failed catastrophically at the battles that followed. In Part 1, we witnessed the catastrophe at Vela Gulf. Commander Frederick Moosbrugger's 6 American destroyers annihilated 3 Japanese warships in 37 minutes using radar-directed torpedo attacks. Captain Kaju Sugiura, the man who literally wrote Japan's torpedo manual, never saw the enemy that destroyed him. 1,500 Japanese sailors and soldiers died that night. American casualties, 1 crushed hand. But this victory did not happen by accident. It happened because Moosbrugger trusted a technology that most naval commanders still considered experimental and unreliable. And here is where the story becomes even more extraordinary. Because the real battle was not fought in Vela Gulf. The real battle was fought in conference rooms, planning offices, and aboard ships where stubborn admirals refused to believe that electronic systems could replace human eyes. Before Moosbrugger could execute his revolutionary tactics, he had to overcome something far more dangerous than Japanese destroyers: the United States Navy's own institutional resistance to change. And this is where everything became much harder. The problem began at the highest levels of Pacific Fleet Command. Throughout 1942 and early 1943, American destroyers had been equipped with increasingly sophisticated radar systems. The SC Air Search Radar appeared first. Then the SG Surface Search Radar, which could detect destroyer-sized targets at ranges exceeding 12,000 meters. The technology existed, the equipment was installed, but commanders refused to trust it. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commanding amphibious forces in the South Pacific, exemplified the old thinking. Turner had extensive combat experience. He had survived multiple engagements against Japanese forces, and he believed absolutely in the supremacy of trained human observation over electronic gadgets. Radar, Turner argued, produced false contacts. It confused operators. It created phantom ships that did not exist and missed real ships that did. Trained lookouts with binoculars remained the gold standard for naval observation. This attitude was not irrational. Early radar systems did produce confusing returns. Land masses created clutter on screens. Weather interference generated false contacts. Inexperienced operators misidentified targets constantly. At the Battle of Savo Island, American ships had radar contact on approaching Japanese cruisers, but dismissed the returns as islands or friendly vessels. The result was catastrophic defeat. Rather than concluding that operators needed better training, many senior officers concluded that radar itself was unreliable. The institutional memory of radar failures became self-reinforcing. Officers who distrusted radar did not invest in training radar operators. Poorly trained operators made mistakes. Mistakes confirmed that radar was untrustworthy. The cycle continued. Meanwhile, Japanese destroyers kept winning night battles. American cruisers kept sinking. Sailors kept dying. By mid-1943, the United States Navy had lost more cruisers in night surface actions around Guadalcanal than in any other campaign in history. Something had to change. But changing naval doctrine required overcoming decades of tradition and the personal opinions of admirals who had built careers on different assumptions. Commander Moosbrugger was not a famous officer. He did not have powerful patrons in Washington. He commanded a destroyer division, a relatively junior position in the naval hierarchy. When he proposed his radar-centric tactics to senior commanders, the response was skeptical at best. One staff officer reportedly told him, "Commander, we have been fighting the Japanese for 18 months. Our lookouts are trained. Our procedures are established. You want us to abandon what we know works Because you believe in a television screen. The characterization of radar as a television screen was deliberately dismissive. It reflected widespread contempt among traditional officers for electronic warfare systems. Moose Brugger could have accepted the conventional wisdom. He could have followed established doctrine and hoped for better results. Instead, he found an unexpected ally who would change everything. Rear Admiral Theodore Stark Wilkinson assumed command of amphibious forces in the South Pacific in July 1943. Wilkinson was different from his predecessors. He had served in intelligence roles earlier in his career and understood the value of information superiority. More importantly, Wilkinson had studied the night battles around Guadalcanal carefully. He recognized a pattern that other admirals missed. In every engagement where American forces had detected Japanese ships on radar but failed to act on that information quickly, the result was disaster. In the few engagements where commanders trusted radar and acted decisively, results improved dramatically. Wilkinson concluded that the problem was not radar technology. The problem was doctrine and leadership. When Moose Brugger briefed his tactical plan, Wilkinson listened carefully. The plan was simple, but revolutionary. Use radar to detect Japanese forces at maximum range. Maintain absolute silence to avoid detection. Launch torpedoes before the enemy knows you exist. Withhold gunfire until torpedoes hit. Wilkinson's staff officers raised objections. This contradicted established procedures. It placed excessive trust in electronic systems. It violated protocols for coordinated cruiser-destroyer operations. Wilkinson overruled them. He gave Moose Brugger tactical freedom to conduct operations as he judged best. He explicitly authorized deviation from standard doctrine. He accepted personal responsibility for the outcome. This was extraordinary. Flag officers rarely authorized subordinates to ignore established procedures. The professional risk was enormous. If Moose Brugger's tactics failed and ships were lost, Wilkinson's career would be destroyed. But Wilkinson understood something crucial. The current approach was already failing. American ships were already being lost. Continuing to do the same thing while expecting different results was not caution. It was negligence. Moose Brugger now had authorization. He had 6 destroyers with functioning radar systems. He had intelligence indicating Japanese destroyers would transit Vela Gulf on August 6th. He had exactly one opportunity to prove that radar-centric tactics could work. If he failed, the experiment would end. The old doctrine would be vindicated. Electronic warfare advocates would be silenced for years. Everything depended on one night. August 6, 1943. Weather conditions were terrible for visual observation. Intermittent rain squalls reduced visibility to less than 1,000 meters. Low clouds blocked starlight. No moon. Traditional naval doctrine considered these conditions extremely dangerous for offensive operations. Japanese lookouts with their legendary night vision would have significant advantages. Moose Brugger considered the same conditions perfect. His radar did not care about rain. His radar did not need starlight. His radar could see through darkness that blinded human eyes completely. At 2200 hours, Moose Brugger's 6 destroyers entered Vela Gulf in 2 parallel columns. Division 12 formed the port column Dunlap-Craven-Maury. Division 15 formed the starboard column Lang-Sterrett-Stack. Separation between columns was 4,000 meters. Speed was 25 knots. All lights extinguished. Radio silence absolute. In the combat information centers aboard each ship, radar operators hunched over their screens. The SG radar antennas rotated continuously, sending microwave pulses into the darkness and listening for returns. The plan position indicator displays showed the tactical situation as glowing points of light against dark backgrounds. At 22:33 hours, USS Dunlap's radar operator called out, "Contact, bearing 340, range 29500. The contact was nearly 16 nautical miles away. At that range, even the best human lookouts could see nothing. The Japanese destroyers were completely invisible to the naked eye. But on American radar screens, they appeared as four distinct points of light moving steadily southeast toward Blackett Strait. Moosbrugger watched the display with intense concentration. He could see the Japanese formation clearly. Four ships in column, maintaining precise spacing, making approximately 30 knots. They had no idea American destroyers were waiting. For 20 minutes, Moosbrugger tracked the Japanese force. His radar operators provided continuous updates on bearing range and course. His fire control teams calculated torpedo solutions. His ships maneuvered into optimal attack position without making any visual or radio emissions that might alert the enemy. This was the moment of truth. Every assumption about radar-centric tactics would be tested. Every skeptic who had dismissed electronic warfare would be proven right or wrong. At 23:41 hours, with range close to 6,300 meters, Moosbrugger gave the order. All ships in Division 12 fired torpedoes simultaneously. 24 Mark 15 torpedoes entered the water in 63 seconds. The weapons accelerated to 36 knots and began their run toward targets that still did not know they were under attack. Moosbrugger immediately ordered his division to turn away. The destroyers executed a 90-degree turn to starboard at maximum speed. They were withdrawing before the Japanese even detected their presence. Aboard the Japanese flagship, Hagikaze Captain Sugiura stood on his bridge, seeing nothing. His lookouts reported ambiguous sightings. Perhaps PT boats. Perhaps waves. Perhaps nothing. Then the torpedoes arrived. 3 hit Hagikaze. 2 hit Arashi. 1 hit Kawakaze in her forward magazine. The explosions were devastating. Hagikaze's spine broke. Arashi lost all power. Kawakaze's forward third simply disappeared. In less than 2 minutes, 3 Japanese destroyers were dying. Commander Roger Simpson's Division 15 then opened fire with radar-directed gunfire. The Mark 37 fire control systems tracked burning targets using radar. Shells struck with remarkable accuracy despite total darkness. The Japanese never effectively returned fire. They never launched an organized torpedo attack. They never identified their attackers. They simply died. The engagement lasted 37 minutes. 3 Japanese destroyers sunk, over 1,500 men killed. American losses, 1 sailor with a crushed hand. When Moosbrugger's after-action report reached fleet headquarters, the impact was immediate and profound. The statistics were undeniable. Detection range advantage. American radar saw Japanese ships at 29th on 500 meters. Japanese lookouts saw nothing until 3,000 meters. A 10-to-1 advantage. Hit rate of 24 torpedoes launched at least 8 struck targets. A 33% hit rate compared to the 5 to 10% typical of previous American torpedo attacks. Casualty ratio, over 1,500 Japanese dead versus 1 American injured. This was not marginal improvement. This was revolutionary transformation of night combat effectiveness. Admiral Wilkinson forwarded the report with strong recommendations for doctrinal revision. Senior commanders who had dismissed radar-centric tactics suddenly became advocates. The evidence was impossible to ignore. Within weeks, Pacific Fleet began implementing systematic changes. Combat information centers were reorganized to give radar operators greater authority. Training programs emphasized electronic warfare skills. Tactical doctrine was rewritten to make radar the primary sensor for night operations. But institutional change moved slowly. Many destroyer captains remained skeptical. They had survived previous engagements using traditional methods. They trusted their lookouts. They distrusted glowing screens. Moosbrugger and other radar advocates found themselves traveling to forward bases, briefing skeptical officers, demonstrating equipment capabilities, and slowly converting doubters into believers. The process took months. Meanwhile, the Japanese High Command was trying to understand what had happened at Vela Gulf. Commander Tamichi Hara, the sole surviving Japanese destroyer captain, filed a detailed report. His conclusion was alarming. The Americans possessed technological capabilities that made traditional night fighting doctrine obsolete. Japanese naval intelligence began investigating American radar systems with new urgency. They knew something had changed fundamentally. But knowing the problem existed and solving it were different matters entirely. By late 1943, American destroyer forces had adopted radar-centric tactics as standard doctrine. The results were consistent. At the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay on November 2nd, American radar-directed gunfire devastated Japanese cruiser forces. At the Battle of Cape St. George on November 25th, Captain Arleigh Burke used Vela Gulf tactics to sink 3 Japanese destroyers without loss. The Tokyo Express was finished. Japanese night-fighting superiority was broken. But the Japanese were not surrendering. They were adapting. Intelligence reports indicated Japanese engineers were working frantically on their own radar systems. Japanese tactics were evolving to counter American electronic advantages. And something else was happening that American commanders did not yet fully understand. The Japanese had captured American radar equipment from damaged ships. They were studying it. They were learning, and they were preparing countermeasures that would soon challenge everything the Americans had achieved. In Part 3, we will see the Japanese response unfold. We will witness desperate technological races. We will watch as both sides adapted and counter-adapted in an electronic warfare spiral that neither had anticipated. Because the victory at Vela Gulf was not an ending. It was the beginning of an entirely new kind of naval warfare, and the real technological battle was just starting. In Parts 1 and 2, we witnessed a revolution in naval warfare. Commander Frederick Moosbrugger proved that radar-directed tactics could annihilate Japanese forces in night combat. At Vela Gulf, 6 American destroyers destroyed 3 Japanese warships in 37 minutes with essentially 0 casualties. Admiral Wilkinson championed the new doctrine against institutional resistance. By late 1943, radar-centric tactics became standard across Pacific Fleet destroyer forces. The results were devastating for Japan. But the Imperial Japanese Navy was not finished. When intelligence reports from Vela Gulf reached Tokyo, they triggered a response that would test American technological superiority to its absolute limits. Japanese engineers began working around the clock. Japanese tacticians developed countermeasures. Japanese commanders adapted their operations. The Americans had won the first round. But this was a fight to the death, and Japan was preparing to strike back with everything it had. The intelligence summary that reached Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters in September 1943 was alarming. Commander Tamichi Hara's after-action report from Vela Gulf contained a devastating assessment. The enemy performed superbly that night and did everything correctly. They ambushed us brilliantly. Never before had I seen such marksmanship. Hara concluded explicitly that American radar capabilities had fundamentally changed night combat. His report circulated among senior commanders and technical officers. The implications were impossible to ignore. For 20 years, the Imperial Japanese Navy had built its entire surface warfare doctrine around night-fighting superiority. Japanese lookouts were the best trained in the world. Japanese torpedoes outranged everything the Americans possessed. Japanese tactical doctrine exploited darkness to neutralize American numerical advantages. Now a single technology had rendered all of that obsolete. The statistics from successive engagements confirmed Hara's assessment. At the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay on November 2, 1943, American cruisers and destroyers engaged a Japanese force attempting to attack the Bougainville beachhead. American radar detected the Japanese at extreme range. American gunfire was directed by radar fire control systems. The result, 1 Japanese cruiser sunk 3 cruisers and 1 destroyer heavily damaged. Japanese losses exceeded 600 men. American losses. No ships sunk, minor damage to 2 destroyers, 19 men killed. The casualty ratio was over 30 to 1 in American favor. 3 weeks later, At the Battle of Cape St. George on November 25th, Captain R. Lee Burke led 5 American destroyers against 5 Japanese destroyers evacuating troops from Buka. Burke employed Vela Gulf tactics precisely: silent approach, radar tracking, torpedo attack before gun action. The Americans sank 3 Japanese destroyers and damaged a 4th. American losses, none. 0 ships damaged. 0 casualties. The Japanese destroyer force that had terrorized American shipping for 2 years was being systematically annihilated. Imperial Japanese Navy leadership convened emergency technical conferences. The consensus was clear: Japan needed radar. Japanese engineers had developed primitive radar systems before the war, but the technology had been neglected in favor of optical systems. Now that decision was proving catastrophic. Development of the Type 22 surface search radar accelerated dramatically. The Type 22 operated at 375 MHz with an 80-centimeter wavelength. Maximum detection range against destroyer-sized targets was approximately 8,000 meters under optimal conditions. This was significantly inferior to American SG radar, which could detect similar targets at 12,000 to 15,000 meters. But any radar was better than no radar. Production facilities worked overtime. Training programs for radar operators were established. Installation teams deployed to forward bases. By early 1944, Japanese destroyers began receiving Type 22 radar sets. But technology alone was not enough. Japanese tactical doctrine also required fundamental revision. The traditional approach of aggressive torpedo attacks from close range no longer worked against enemies who could see you coming from 15 kilometers away. Japanese commanders experimented with new tactics: dispersed formations to complicate radar tracking smokescreens, to create false returns, night fighter aircraft to locate and attack American ships. None of these countermeasures proved effective. The fundamental problem remained: American radar provided information superiority that Japanese systems could not match. But the Japanese adaptation efforts created new challenges for American forces. As radar-centric tactics spread throughout Pacific Fleet, unexpected problems emerged. The first issue was training. The sophisticated equipment that made Vela Gulf possible required skilled operators. Commander Moosbrugger's radar teams had trained extensively before the battle. They understood their equipment's capabilities and limitations. They could distinguish genuine contacts from false returns. They could track multiple targets simultaneously. But as radar tactics became standard doctrine, the demand for trained operators far exceeded supply. New operators received abbreviated training programs. They made mistakes that experienced operators would have avoided. False contacts were reported as genuine. Genuine contacts were dismissed as clutter. The technology that had produced decisive victory at Vela Gulf sometimes produced confusion and hesitation when operated by inexperienced personnel. The second issue was overconfidence. Some commanders concluded that radar made them invincible in night combat. They took risks that experienced radar tacticians would have avoided. They closed to ranges where Japanese optical systems could function effectively. They broke radio silence at critical moments. They assumed that technological superiority guaranteed tactical success. These mistakes occasionally produced casualties that should have been avoided. The Battle of Kula Gulf on July 6, 1943, before Vela Gulf had demonstrated this danger. American ships detected Japanese destroyers on radar, but failed to coordinate their response effectively. The result was the loss of cruiser USS Helena, despite radar advantages. Similar coordination failures continued to occur even after Vela Gulf established better tactical doctrine. Critics within the Navy used these failures to argue against radar-centric tactics. The technology is unreliable, they claimed. Human judgment remains superior. We are abandoning proven methods for experimental systems. These arguments found receptive audiences among officers who had built careers on traditional approaches. The institutional resistance that Admiral Wilkinson had overcome in August 1943 reasserted itself in different forms. Budget battles erupted over funding for radar development versus funding for conventional systems. Training programs competed for limited resources. Doctrine revisions stalled in bureaucratic committees. Commander Moosbrugger and other radar advocates found themselves fighting the same arguments they had supposedly won months earlier. The technology had proven itself in combat. The results were undeniable. But institutional change remained painfully slow. November 25, 1943. The waters northeast of Cape St. George, New Ireland. 5 American destroyers under Captain R. Lee Burke intercepted 5 Japanese destroyers evacuating troops from Buka Island. This engagement would prove beyond any remaining doubt that radar-centric tactics represented the future of naval warfare. Burke commanded Destroyer Division 45 USS Charles Osborne, USS Claxton, and USS Dyson. Commander Bernard Austin commanded Destroyer Division 46 USS Converse and USS Spence. All 5 ships carried SG surface search radar and Mark 37 fire control systems. All 5 captains had studied Vela Gulf and trained their crews accordingly. At 0140 hours, Burke's radar operators detected Japanese contacts bearing northwest at range 22,000 meters. 5 ships in 2 groups. The Japanese were completely unaware of American presence. Burke immediately ordered battle stations. His destroyers accelerated to 33 knots. The formation maneuvered to cross the Japanese track and achieve optimal torpedo firing position. Radio discipline was absolute. No unnecessary transmissions. No illumination. The American ships were invisible in the darkness, while Japanese movements appeared clearly on radar screens. At 0155 hours, with range close to 5,000 meters, Burke ordered torpedo attack. Division 45 launched 15 torpedoes. The weapons entered the water silently. Flash suppressors on torpedo tubes minimized visible signatures. The Japanese still had not detected American presence. Time to target approximately 3 minutes. Burke ordered immediate turn away. His 3 destroyers executed hard right rudder and accelerated to maximum speed, withdrawing to the northeast. This was the Vela Gulf template executed perfectly. At 0158 hours, the first torpedo struck destroyer Onami. The explosion was massive. Onami's forward magazine detonated. The ship broke apart and sank in less than 2 minutes. 2 more torpedoes struck destroyer Makanami seconds later. Both hit below the waterline amidships. Makanami lost all power and began settling rapidly. The Japanese formation dissolved into chaos. Commanders did not understand what was happening. They had not seen enemy ships. They had not detected torpedo launches. Their vessels were simply exploding. Division 46 now engaged the 2nd Japanese group. Commander Austin maneuvered his 2 destroyers around the burning wrecks and pressed the attack. His ships opened fire with radar-directed 5-inch guns. Shells struck with remarkable accuracy. Destroyer Yugiri took multiple hits. Fires broke out across her superstructure. Her speed dropped. Her steering failed. Burke's Division 45 completed its turn and rejoined the engagement. The 5 American destroyers concentrated fire on Yugiri. The Japanese destroyer fought back desperately, launching torpedoes and firing her guns at muzzle flashes. But without radar, she was shooting blind. American shells struck again and again. At 0228 hours, Yugiri capsized and sank. 3 Japanese destroyers destroyed. 2 escaped into the darkness badly damaged. Japanese losses exceeded 800 men. American losses none. Not a single American ship took damage. Not a single American sailor was killed or wounded. The engagement lasted 48 minutes. The result was total annihilation of the Japanese force. Captain Burke's after-action report documented the tactical execution in detail. But one passage captured the strategic significance. The enemy was completely surprised. Our radar gave us perfect information about their positions, while they knew nothing about ours. We achieved decisive engagement on our terms. This is the future of naval combat. The Battle of Cape St. George proved that Vela Gulf was not a fluke. It was not luck or exceptional circumstances. It was the predictable result of information superiority exploited through sound doctrine. When American destroyers followed the radar-centric template, they won. They won decisively. They won without losses. Burke received promotion to Commodore shortly after Cape St. George. His tactical innovations became official doctrine across Pacific Fleet. The man who would later become Chief of Naval Operations and serve longer than any other officer in that position, built his reputation on electronic warfare principles that seemed radical just months earlier. The cumulative impact of American radar superiority transformed the Pacific War. Japanese destroyer losses in night surface actions approached catastrophic levels by early 1944. Before Vela Gulf, Japanese destroyers had sunk or damaged American vessels at ratios approaching 2-to-1. After Vela Gulf, those ratios reversed completely. American destroyers were destroying Japanese destroyers at ratios exceeding 5-to-1. The Tokyo Express, which had successfully supplied Japanese garrisons throughout the Solomon Islands campaign, despite American efforts to stop it, ceased operations entirely. Japanese commanders simply could not risk destroyer forces against American radar-equipped ships. The supply situation for isolated Japanese garrisons became desperate. Without the Tokyo Express, Japanese soldiers on bypassed islands faced starvation. Kolombangara, which Captain Sugiura had been attempting to resupply when his destroyers were destroyed at Vela Gulf, was evacuated in September 1943. The Japanese rescued approximately 9,600 men but abandoned the strategic position entirely. Similar evacuations occurred across the Central and Northern Solomons. Japanese forces that had fought tenaciously to hold territory simply withdrew when supply became impossible. The American island-hopping strategy exploited this vulnerability ruthlessly. Rather than attacking heavily defended Japanese positions directly, American forces bypassed them and cut supply lines. Japanese garrisons that might have resisted for months surrendered or starved when radar-equipped destroyers prevented resupply operations. The strategic implications extended beyond the Solomons. Japanese naval planners recognized that surface combat doctrine required fundamental revision. Resources that might have gone to destroyer construction were redirected to submarines and aircraft. Surface fleet operations became increasingly defensive. The aggressive night attack doctrine that had terrorized American forces for 2 years was abandoned because it no longer worked. American commanders who had initially resisted radar-centric tactics became converts. The evidence was overwhelming. Detection range advantages of 10-to-1. Casualty ratios exceeding 30-to-1. Complete tactical surprise in engagement after engagement. Radar was not an experimental technology. It was not an unreliable gadget. It was the decisive factor in surface naval combat. Commander Frederick Moosbrugger received the Navy Cross for Vela Gulf. Captain Arleigh Burke received the Navy Cross for Cape St. George. Admiral Theodore Stark Wilkinson, who had championed radar tactics against institutional resistance, received recognition as one of the most innovative commanders of the Pacific War. The radar operators who made these victories possible remained largely anonymous. Their names appeared in crew rosters but not in official citations. By early 1944, American radar superiority had fundamentally transformed Pacific naval warfare. Japanese destroyer forces were decimated. Japanese supply operations were crippled. Japanese tactical doctrine was obsolete. The men who had championed radar-centric tactics against institutional resistance were vindicated completely. But what happened to them after the war? Commander Moosbrugger continued serving through 1945 and retired as a rear admiral. Captain Burke became the legendary Admiral Arleigh Burke, serving as Chief of Naval Operations for an unprecedented 6 years. Commander Tamichi Hara, the Japanese officer who survived Vela Gulf and recognized immediately what American radar meant, became the only Japanese destroyer captain to survive the entire war, commanding destroyers from December 1941 through August 1945. Captain Kaju Sugiura, the man who literally wrote Japan's torpedo manual and lost 3 ships at Vela Gulf, was given command of heavy cruiser Haguro in 1945. He died when British destroyers sank Haguro off Malaya on May 16, 1945, using the same radar-directed tactics that had destroyed his destroyer force 2 years earlier. The irony was complete. But beyond the individual fates, a larger question remained. What did Vela Gulf mean for naval warfare? What lessons did it teach that remain relevant today? How did one night in August 1943 change everything that came after? In Part 4, we will explore the legacy that extended far beyond World War II. We will see how radar technology evolved into the sophisticated electronic warfare systems that dominate modern combat. We will examine what happened to the men who fought that night and how history remembered them. And we will discover why a 37-minute battle in the darkness of Vela Gulf still matters 80 years later. This story has one final chapter, and it may be the most important chapter of all. We have traveled through one of the most remarkable stories of World War II. It began with a catastrophe in the darkness of Vela Gulf, where 3 Japanese destroyers exploded simultaneously, and 500 men died in 37 minutes. It continued through the institutional battles, where Commander Frederick Moosbrugger and Admiral Theodore Stark Wilkinson fought against decades of naval tradition to prove that radar could replace human eyes. It reached its climax at Cape St. George, where Captain R. Lee Burke annihilated a Japanese destroyer force without suffering a single casualty. American radar superiority transformed Pacific naval warfare completely. Japanese night-fighting doctrine became obsolete. The Tokyo Express ceased operations. The strategic balance shifted irreversibly toward Allied victory. But what happened to the men who fought that night in Vela Gulf? What became of the technology they proved? And why does a battle fought 80 years ago in a remote corner of the Pacific still matter today? This story has one final twist that almost no one knows about. Because success in war sometimes comes with a price that only becomes clear decades later. Commander Frederick Moosbrugger continued his naval career after Vela Gulf with distinction. The Navy Cross he received recognized his tactical innovation and aggressive leadership. He commanded destroyer squadrons through the remainder of the Pacific War, participating in operations from the Philippines to Okinawa. After the war, Moosbrugger rose steadily through the ranks. He served in increasingly senior positions, applying the lessons of electronic warfare to peacetime naval development. He retired as a Rear Admiral in 1956, respected within the service, but largely unknown to the public. His name does not appear in most popular histories of World War II. The battle that proved radar superiority is often attributed to other commanders, or described without naming the officer who conceived and executed the tactics. Moosbrugger died in 1974, having never sought publicity for his achievements. His contribution to naval warfare remains recognized primarily by specialists and historians who study the details of Pacific combat operations. Captain R. Lee Burke followed a dramatically different path. His victory at Cape St. George, combined with aggressive leadership throughout the Solomon Islands campaign, earned him promotion to Commodore at age 42. After the war, Burke's career accelerated rapidly. He served as Chief of Naval Operations from 1955 to 1961, an unprecedented 6 consecutive years in the Navy's highest position. During his tenure, Burke championed nuclear submarine development, guided missile technology, and the electronic warfare systems that descended directly from the radar innovations of World War II. The R. Lee Burke-class destroyers, the most numerous surface combatants in the modern United States Navy, bear his name. Burke became one of the most celebrated naval officers in American history. His reputation built substantially on foundations laid at Vela Gulf and Cape St. George. He died in 1996 at age 94, having witnessed the evolution of naval technology from optical rangefinders to satellite-guided weapons. Admiral Theodore Stark Wilkinson, who championed radar tactics against institutional resistance, received less recognition than his contribution deserved. He commanded amphibious operations throughout the Pacific, including the invasions of Guam Palelu and the Philippines. His willingness to authorize tactical innovation by subordinates like Moosbrugger created conditions for American success in night surface combat. Wilkinson died in an automobile accident in 1946, just 1 year after the war ended. He was 58 years old. His death deprived naval history of memoirs and reflections that might have documented the institutional battles behind radar adoption more completely. The Japanese commanders experienced darker fates. Captain Kaju Sugiura, who lost 3 destroyers at Vela Gulf, was given command of heavy cruiser Haguro in 1945. On May 16, 1945, British destroyers intercepted Haguro in the Malacca Strait. The British ships used radar-directed tactics identical to those that had destroyed Sugiura's destroyers 2 years earlier. Haguro was torpedoed and sunk. Sugiura died with his ship never escaping the technology that had ended his destroyer command. Commander Tamechi Hara, who survived Vela Gulf aboard Shigure, became the only Japanese destroyer captain to command destroyers throughout the entire Pacific War. His ship Shigure gained a reputation as a fortune ship that survived engagements where other vessels were destroyed. Hara's luck finally ended when Shigure was torpedoed and sunk by USS Blackfin in January 1945. Hara was not aboard, having transferred to light cruiser Yahagi. He survived the war and wrote memoirs that became essential historical sources about Japanese naval operations. His honest assessment of American radar superiority provided invaluable insight into how Japanese commanders experienced technological defeat. But the legacy of these men extends far beyond their individual fates. The SG surface search radar that proved decisive at Vela Gulf was only the beginning. American radar development accelerated dramatically after 1943, driven by combat experience that demonstrated electronic warfare's decisive importance. By 1945, American warships carried multiple radar systems, providing comprehensive coverage from surface contacts to high-altitude aircraft. The Mark 37 fire control system evolved into increasingly sophisticated targeting computers. Analog electromechanical calculators gave way to digital computers. Range accuracy improved from hundreds of meters to single meters. The integration of radar with weapons systems became seamless and automatic. After World War II, radar technology spread throughout global naval forces. The principles proven at Vela Gulf became universal doctrine. Every modern navy operates on the assumption that electronic sensors provide primary situational awareness. Visual observation, which dominated naval warfare for millennia, became supplementary to electronic systems. The numbers tell the story of transformation. During the period from Pearl Harbor through July 1943, before radar-centric tactics became standard, American destroyers in night surface actions suffered casualty ratios that often favored Japanese forces. After Vela Gulf and the adoption of radar doctrine, those ratios reversed completely. American destroyer losses to Japanese surface ships declined by over 80%, while Japanese destroyer losses increased correspondingly. Conservative estimates suggest that radar superiority in surface combat saved thousands of American sailors' lives during the final 2 years of the Pacific War. The strategic impact was equally dramatic. Japanese supplies to island garrisons declined precipitously after August 1943. Garrison after garrison found itself isolated, unable to receive reinforcements or equipment. The island-hopping strategy that carried American forces across the Pacific depended fundamentally on the ability to interdict Japanese supply lines. Radar-equipped destroyers provided that interdiction capability. Modern naval combat systems descend directly from the innovations proven at Vela Gulf. The Aegis combat system, which equips American cruisers and destroyers today, integrates radar fire control and weapons systems in ways that Commander Moosbrugger would recognize immediately. The fundamental concept remains identical. Use electronic sensors to detect threats beyond visual range. Track multiple targets simultaneously and engage with precision weapons, before the enemy can respond effectively. Detection ranges have increased from kilometers to hundreds of kilometers. Processing speeds have increased from seconds to milliseconds. But the operational philosophy established in August 1943 continues to guide naval combat doctrine 8 decades later. The radar operators who tracked Japanese destroyers through the darkness of Vela Gulf were pioneers of a technological revolution that transformed not only naval warfare but military operations across all domains. The story of radar at Vela Gulf teaches lessons that extend far beyond naval history. The first lesson concerns innovation itself. The technology that proved decisive existed before August 1943. American ships had carried SG radar for months. The equipment was installed, maintained, and operated, but the technology remained unexploited because institutional doctrine did not accommodate it. Commanders continued using tactics designed for visual observation, even when electronic sensors provided superior information. Innovation requires not only technical capability, but also doctrinal adaptation and leadership willing to challenge established procedures. Commander Moosbrugger provided that leadership. Admiral Wilkinson provided the authority to act on it. Without both elements, the technology would have remained underutilized. The second lesson concerns institutional resistance to change. The United States Navy in 1943 was not a backward organization. It was one of the most technologically advanced military forces in human history. Yet even within this sophisticated institution, new approaches faced skepticism, bureaucratic obstruction, and active opposition from officers invested in traditional methods. The resistance was not irrational. Early radar systems had produced failures. Trusting electronic systems over trained human judgment seemed risky. The officers who opposed radar-centric tactics were not stupid or cowardly. They were experienced professionals applying lessons from their own careers. But experience can become a trap when circumstances change fundamentally. The lesson applies far beyond military organizations. Every institution faces the challenge of adapting established procedures to new capabilities. The organizations that succeed are those that create mechanisms for testing innovations despite institutional skepticism. The third lesson concerns the decisive importance of information superiority. At Vela Gulf, American and Japanese forces were roughly comparable in conventional terms. Both sides had capable destroyers, trained crews, and effective weapons. The decisive difference was information. American commanders knew where Japanese ships were located, while Japanese commanders operated blind. This information asymmetry produced casualty ratios that seem almost impossible over 1,500 Japanese dead versus 1 American injured. The pattern repeated at Cape St. George and subsequent engagements. When one side possesses comprehensive situational awareness while the other side operates without information, the outcome approaches inevitability regardless of courage training or tactical skill. Modern military doctrine emphasizes this principle explicitly. Information dominance has become the foundation of operational planning across all service branches. Similar patterns appear throughout military history. The German blitzkrieg tactics of 1940 succeeded partly because radio communications allowed German commanders to coordinate faster than French and British headquarters could respond. The Israeli victory in the 1967 Six-Day War depended heavily on intelligence about Arab Air Force dispositions. Operation Desert Storm in 1991 demonstrated information superiority through precision strikes on Iraqi command networks. The thread connecting these examples leads directly back to Vela Gulf, where radar-directed destroyers proved that seeing the enemy before being seen translates into decisive combat advantage. There is one final element of this story that most accounts overlook entirely. On the night of August 6, 1943, approximately 15 American PT boats were also operating in Vela Gulf. These small, fast craft had attempted to intercept the previous Tokyo Express run on August 1st. They had fired approximately 30 torpedoes at Japanese destroyers. All 30 missed. The PT boats represented exactly the kind of aggressive close-range night fighting that traditional doctrine favored. They relied on visual detection, high speed, and surprise. Against Japanese destroyers with superior optical equipment and highly trained lookouts, the PT boats proved nearly useless. Among those PT boats operating in the Solomons in August 1943 was PT-109, commanded by Lieutenant John F. Kennedy. On August 2nd, just 4 days before Vela Gulf, PT-109 was rammed and sunk by Japanese destroyer Amagiri. Kennedy and his surviving crew members spent days in the water before being rescued. The future President of the United States nearly died in the same waters where Commander Moosbrugger would prove that electronic warfare, not heroic small boat attacks, represented the future of naval combat. The contrast is striking. Kennedy's PT-109 mission failed because visual range night fighting against Japanese destroyers was essentially suicidal by 1943. Japanese optical superiority made such attacks extremely dangerous. 4 days later, Moosbrugger's destroyers proved that engaging Japanese forces from beyond visual range, using radar, produced the opposite result: devastating success with minimal risk. Two approaches to the same tactical problem, two completely different outcomes. Kennedy survived his failed mission and went on to lead a nation. Moosbrugger succeeded in his mission and remained largely unknown. History remembers the dramatic personal story of PT-109 far more vividly than the technically decisive but less cinematically compelling victory at Vela Gulf. Yet Moosbrugger's approach, not Kennedy's, pointed toward the future of naval warfare. There is one additional detail that emerged from Japanese records decades after the war. Commander Hara's torpedoes launched from Shigure during the battle actually struck USS Dunlap. Multiple Type 93 torpedoes hit Moosbrugger's flagship. Every single one was a dud. The warheads failed to detonate. If Japanese torpedo reliability had matched Japanese torpedo design, Dunlap might have been destroyed, and the battle's outcome changed entirely. American victory at Vela Gulf depended not only on radar superiority, but also on Japanese quality control failures that prevented their weapons from functioning properly. Technology cuts both ways. The same industrial capacity that gave Americans reliable radar also gave Americans reliable torpedoes. The same resource constraints that prevented Japan from developing competitive radar also degraded Japanese torpedo manufacturing quality. Vela Gulf was a victory of systems, not just sensors. From the darkness of Vela Gulf to the foundations of modern naval warfare, this story spans 8 decades of technological evolution. Commander Frederick Moosbrugger took 6 destroyers into battle against a Japanese force that should have possessed every advantage in night combat. He trusted electronic systems that most admirals considered unreliable. He designed tactics that contradicted established doctrine. He maintained discipline that previous American forces had failed to achieve. The result was one of the most lopsided victories in naval history. 3 Japanese destroyers destroyed. Over 1,500 enemy personnel killed. 0 American ships damaged. 1 sailor injured. 37 minutes from first torpedo to final sinking. The men who made this victory possible followed different paths after the war. Moosbrugger served honorably and retired quietly. Burke became a legendary admiral whose name adorns the Navy's premier destroyer class. Wilkinson died before his contributions could be fully recognized. Sugiura perished at sea, killed by the same technology that had destroyed his command. Hara survived to document the Japanese experience for future historians. The technology they proved has become the foundation of modern naval operations. Every warship afloat today carries systems descended from the SG radar and Mark 37 fire control that dominated at Vela Gulf. Detection ranges have increased 1,000-fold. Processing speeds have increased 1,000,000-fold, but the fundamental principle remains unchanged. Information superiority produces combat superiority. C. First act, first win first. The lessons apply far beyond naval warfare. Innovation requires not just new technology, but new doctrine and leadership willing to challenge tradition. Institutional resistance to change is normal and must be overcome through demonstrated results. Information superiority translates into decisive advantage across every domain of competition. These principles proved true at Vela Gulf in 1943. They remain true in 2024. If you know similar stories of innovations that seemed crazy until they changed everything, share them in the comments below. World War II produced hundreds of such breakthroughs, each with its own cast of forgotten heroes and institutional battles. This channel explores those stories because they reveal truths about human nature, organizational behavior, and technological change that remain relevant long after the last veteran has passed. Subscribe to discover more history that most people never learn, because the past is full of lessons, and the people who understand those lessons are better prepared for whatever the future brings. In the end, Vela Gulf teaches us something profound about courage. Not the courage to charge enemy guns or face death in combat. The courage to trust something new. The courage to challenge what everyone knows is true. The courage to be wrong in front of everyone watching. Commander Moosebrugger had that courage. Admiral Wilkinson had that courage. And because they did, thousands of American sailors came home who otherwise would have died in the darkness of Pacific night battles. That is the power of innovation. That is the legacy of Vela Gulf. That is why this story deserves to be remembered.